An old man, dressed in clothes that were worn and frayed, walked into a Chase Bank branch on a quiet afternoon. In a calm voice, he made a startling declaration. At first, the people inside chuckled. They thought it was a joke. A security guard moved toward him, ready to escort him out. But when the old man slowly reached a hand into the faded satchel slung over his shoulder, a sudden silence fell. The quiet in the room became heavy, expectant. Just then, the front doors swung open again, causing everyone to turn their heads. All eyes went to the entrance. Another elderly man stepped inside. His hair was white, unkempt, and wild. His face was a roadmap of years of hardship. He wore a long, heavy brown coat, faded and patched, stained from a lifetime of use. His shoes were nearly falling apart, and each step he took was heavy and slow. He carried a rough canvas bag over one shoulder, frayed at the edges, looking as if it had been through a lifetime of journeys. As he walked deeper into the bank, a murmur rippled through the customers. It was a mix of quiet laughter and secretive glances. A white woman in her 50s, dressed in expensive clothing, tightened her grip on her designer handbag, eyeing the old man with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Behind the counter, a young teller smirked and whispered to his coworker. He must have taken a wrong turn. What a mess. His colleague rolled her eyes and replied with a grin, clearly judging the old man based solely on his appearance. But the man seemed not to notice. He walked with a quiet determination, his eyes deep-set and steady, oblivious to the judgments and scorn around him. He made his way to the center of the lobby and stopped. The whispering faded. The entire room fell silent again, thick with tension and curiosity. From the side, a tall security guard in a crisp uniform approached. His expression was serious, almost angry. He was Stephen Miller, known for his harsh demeanor and short temper. He placed a hand on his holster, glaring at the old man with disgust. Then, something unexpected happened. The old man straightened his back. He looked at the watching crowd and broke the silence. His voice was calm but firm. "This bank is mine." The words echoed like thunder. The silence was immediately shattered by loud, derisive laughter, filled with mockery and disbelief. But Johnny Kirby, the old man, didn't flinch. He stood his ground as if he had expected this exact reaction. As the people laughed, his gaze remained steady, fixed on no one in particular. Amidst the opulent, gleaming bank, he looked entirely out of place, yet somehow, he seemed to be the one who belonged there the most. What they thought was a joke was about to become something far more powerful. Johnny didn't move. In a clear, unwavering voice, he repeated for everyone to hear, "This bank is mine." The room erupted in laughter again, but this time it wasn't just shock, it was tinged with deep condescension. To many of them, the idea of a destitute man owning such an institution was not just ridiculous, but insulting. In one corner, two young tellers, Armando and Martin, whispered mockingly. "I bet he's drunk," Martin said with a sneer. "Some of these old guys from downtown live in a fantasy world." "Maybe he thinks this is the social services office," Armando replied with a snide laugh, just loud enough for Johnny to hear. But he said nothing. He simply stared at the main counter, where Albert Thorne, the bank manager, stood. Thorne was a man in his 40s, with blonde hair, impeccably dressed, and an air of complete control. His sharp blue eyes were piercing and observant. As the laughter and whispering continued, Thorne's brow furrowed. He gave a slight nod to Stephen, the guard. Stephen approached Johnny, his voice dripping with condescension. "All right, old man, the show's over. Time for you to leave." "Don't make this any harder than it has to be," he said, his hand still resting on his firearm. Johnny turned to him slowly but firmly. There was no fear in his eyes. His strange calm gave even Stephen a moment's pause. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," Johnny said, his voice clear. "I came to take back what's mine, what this bank stole from me more than 70 years ago." The room fell silent once more, but this time, it wasn't out of confusion or amusement. It was the beginning of something no one could have ever expected. At first, Albert Thorne thought it was just a minor disturbance, a typical event on a regular afternoon. But a strange tension began to spread. He emerged from behind the counter and approached the old man, forcing a professional demeanor. His posture was polite, but the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. He radiated skepticism and a hint of annoyance. "Sir, I don't know what you believe," he said, his voice calm but distant. "But you're mistaken. This bank has been in the Matthews family for generations. My grandfather helped build it. You must be confused." But Johnny didn't back down. He looked Thorne directly in the eyes and answered firmly, "I'm not confused." With that, he slowly lowered the old bag from his shoulder and carefully placed it on the floor, as if its contents had the power to change everything. "I'll show you," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Right here. Right now." The people nearby began to exchange uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. A few of them took a step back. Most of the customers were white, accustomed to the quiet, affluent life in Rockview, and they did not appreciate this poor, elderly man disrupting their peaceful day with such a bizarre claim. Stephen, the guard, was visibly losing his patience. He moved in quickly, shouting a final warning. "That's it, old man," he yelled. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police. Don't make this worse for yourself." But Johnny was unfazed. Instead, he slowly knelt and began to open his bag. Though his hands were trembling and aged, they moved with purpose. Everyone in the bank was watching him, holding their breath, unable to look away. Even Stephen paused for a moment, slightly loosening his grip on his gun. His face was torn between suspicion and curiosity. "There's something in here that everyone needs to see," Johnny said softly, yet full of confidence. Then, he opened the bag. The very moment he lifted the flap, the atmosphere in the bank shifted. You could feel it. People leaned in, their eyes widening, and the whispers died instantly. Because whatever Johnny was pulling out, it was no trick or figment of an old man's imagination. It was real, and it carried a weight that no one had anticipated. Before anyone could fully see what it was, Stephen lunged forward. The sound of his boots on the marble floor echoed like shattering glass. "That's enough," he roared, his voice filled with rage. "This is a bank, not a homeless shelter for vagrants looking for trouble." The words rang out across the room like a slap. A few of the white customers nodded silently, their faces showing their agreement even if they didn't speak. The old bias resurfaced in their eyes. Some of the bank staff, who had been curious just moments before, now stepped back. A few whispered, quietly siding with Stephen. But Johnny remained calm. He stood firm, as if untouched by the storm of judgment around him. There was no fear on his face, only determination in his deep, dark, unblinking eyes, which were fixed on Stephen. And for the first time, the guard felt a flicker of unease. "I am not here to cause trouble," Johnny said, his voice like an unbreakable stone. "I am here for what is mine. You can insult me, but that won't change the truth." Stephen blinked, taken aback. He was used to people like Johnny cowering and retreating when threatened. But this man was different. There was an unshakable resolve in him, something that couldn't be intimidated. A soft cough broke the silence. Albert spoke again, clearly trying to regain control. His tone was measured and formal. "Stephen, that's enough," he said, without even looking at the guard. His attention was still fixed on Johnny. His voice was still polite, but now colder and more cautious. "Sir, if you have genuine evidence, we are prepared to review it, but I must ask you to refrain from causing any further disturbance in this bank." Johnny gave a slight nod. Then, he carefully pulled an old ledger from his bag. The paper was yellowed and brittle, every page bearing the marks of age. He held it up for everyone to see and spoke again, his voice calm, clear, and powerful. "This is the original ledger of this bank, from 1948, the year I founded it. I am Johnny C. Kirby, and before it was stolen from me through lies and racism, this bank was mine." The room was utterly silent. Everyone stared, some in disbelief, others trying to hide their shock. The name he had spoken seemed to reverberate through the lobby. There were still skeptical glances, but now they were mixed with a growing sense of unease. Behind the counter, Albert Thorne went pale. His hands began to tremble slightly. When Johnny mentioned the surname Kirby, a visible change came over him. He had heard that name before, and it wasn't something that could be easily dismissed. Despite Stephen's tough stance and aggressive posture, a fleeting moment of doubt crossed his face. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. His hand, which had been resting on his belt near his holster, slowly dropped to his side. Without even realizing it, he took a tiny step back. Something had changed. In that instant, he no longer saw Johnny as a vagrant or a confused old man. For the first time, he perhaps felt that the man standing before him carried something more than just old stories. He carried the truth. Johnny stood there, silent but dignified, still holding the old ledger high in the air. His unblinking eyes were fixed on Albert Thorne, and Thorne's face was no longer as composed as it had been moments ago. It was beginning to crumble. Johnny saw the change. The people who had been laughing and looking down on him just minutes earlier were now staring at him with doubt. The foundation of their beliefs was beginning to shake, and with that shift, the entire atmosphere inside the bank transformed. What had been filled with mockery and annoyance was now replaced by a heavy, pregnant silence. Johnny stood like a statue, holding the book like a banner that symbolized a lifetime of seeking justice. And now, that truth was beginning to emerge, piece by piece. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lowered the book. His eyes, full of memory and fire, scanned the room again. No one moved, as if the very air had been frozen. He gently bent down, his knees groaning with the effort, and placed the canvas bag on the floor. The soft sound of the bag against the marble echoed through the room like a thunderclap, making some people flinch. Suddenly, the bag that had seemed so worthless just moments before the bag of a poor old man became the center of everyone's attention. Stephen, who had been the most vocal in his scorn, now looked uncertain. He took another step back, this time intentionally. It was as if his instincts were telling him he was facing something far deeper than he had imagined. His former tough, confident energy had vanished. All that remained was silence, doubt, and fear. Albert Thorne, the bank manager known for his calm professionalism, remained standing, his eyes fixed on the bag, unblinking, as if spellbound. The man who had navigated lawsuits and scandals over the years now looked cornered, unsure of his next move. His hands were clenched at his sides, trembling slightly, but Johnny didn't rush. He let the tension build, like a wave about to break. Then, with slow, deliberate hands shaped by years of struggle, he reached for the bag and began to untie the knots. His fingers, though wrinkled and stiff, moved with a quiet purpose that only deepened the silence around him. One by one, the knots loosened until, finally, with one last pull, the bag fell open. Almost in unison, people leaned forward, unable to stop themselves from staring. And there they saw it. One by one, bundles of old money emerged from the bag, faded, ancient bills, slowly rolling out onto the gleaming floor. Each bundle looked like an antique, bearing the old Chase Bank emblem, a vintage logo that hadn't been used in over 50 years. The banknotes were yellowed, their corners curled like memories that had slept in darkness for decades. A cold chill seemed to pass through the bank. Stephen's eyes widened. He tried to remain calm, but he glanced at Albert Thorne as if searching for an answer. But Thorne looked as if he had just seen a ghost. He was pale, his mouth slightly agape. "Impossible," he whispered, almost inaudibly. "How did you get this?" Johnny didn't answer immediately. He bent down and slowly picked up one of the bundles of cash, holding it like a sacred object. He gently stroked the surface of the old paper, as carefully as someone caressing a memory that had never faded. His eyes glistened for just a moment with a distant emotion, a memory of a time completely different from the present. In 1948, he finally said, his voice low but with an intensity that cut through the air, "I built this bank with my own 2 hands, with my sweat, my dreams, and my sacrifice. Every dollar, every tile beneath your feet bears my name and my story." He paused, then looked directly at Thorne. "But when you saw the color of my skin, you chose to believe a lie. You threw me out. You took what was mine simply because I was a black man." His voice, steady and filled with a lifetime of pain, carried a power that words alone could not measure. In the lobby, the mood shifted again. The people who had laughed and judged him now looked away. Some stared at the floor. A few still refused to believe what they were hearing, but many could no longer ignore it. Stephen, trying to recover from the wave of doubt washing over him, stepped forward again. His tone was more cautious now, the arrogance gone. "That's a good story," he said softly, almost hesitantly. "But how do we know it's true? How could someone like you get this kind of money?" Johnny looked directly into Stephen's eyes. His gaze, calm but sharp, was like a spear that pierced through the young guard's bravado, stopping him in his tracks. For a moment, Stephen felt something strange, a kind of authority that couldn't be explained, emanating from the old man before him. "I am Johnny C. Kirby," Johnny said, his voice quiet but echoing like thunder. The man this bank erased, along with his legacy, his wealth, and even his name. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the now silent lobby. Then he declared, "And I am here to take back what was stolen from me." His words shot through the air, hitting every corner of the vast bank. As his voice soared into the silence, the listeners slowly began to understand. This was no longer a strange incident. They were now witnesses to the unveiling of a long-buried truth. After he spoke, a heavy silence descended upon the room, like a fog pressing down on everyone. Scattered on the cold floor were the old, faded bills, their corners brittle, their ink faded like whispers from a past no one wanted to speak of. Each bundle of money was a reminder of a history that had been intentionally buried. All eyes were now fixed on Johnny. There were faces of shock, others of doubt, but no one could look away from him. Albert Thorne, the bank manager known for his composure under pressure, was visibly losing control. The evidence before him, the money, the ledger, the old man himself, was slowly dismantling the story of history he had believed to be true. For the first time, he felt the solid ground of his authority slipping away from beneath him. Trying to regain control of the situation, Thorne stepped forward and bent down. He picked up one of the bundles of money, examining it carefully. The old Chase Bank logo stamped on the fragile paper sent a sharp pang through his stomach. It was undeniable. It was real, and it was ancient. "You're saying you are Johnny C. Kirby?" Thorne asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "That you founded this bank in 1948? Johnny didn't hesitate. "Yes," he answered, his voice full. "I built this institution from nothing. I gave it all my time, my strength, my dreams. And when it began to succeed, they took it from me, simply because of the color of my skin." Thorne shook his head, as if trying to erase what he had heard, but the words lingered, and the more he tried to deny it, the more real it became. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. His usual composure and control were shattering. Clinging to any remaining logic, Thorne spoke again, his voice louder, as if trying to convince himself. "If you truly are the founder, Mr. Kirby, why is there no record of your name? I've read all the official documents, every archive. We couldn't possibly have been unaware if someone like you was part of this bank's history." The tension was suffocating. Johnny was silent for a moment. Then, he slowly reached back into his old canvas bag, and what he pulled out next sent another chill through the room. In his hands was an old, leather-bound ledger. Its cover, faded and scratched, still bore the words, "Chase Bank Ledger, 1948. He carefully opened it, the pages rustling like dry leaves. He stopped at a section filled with signatures written in old ink. "This is the original ledger," Johnny announced, his voice heavy with history. "My name is in here, Johnny C. Kirby, next to the name of my partner, John Williams. We built this bank together." His voice broke slightly as he continued, the pain evident in every word. But as the money grew and the power expanded, greed took over. John couldn't accept the idea of a black man sharing in his success. So he betrayed me. He forged documents. He spread lies. He paid people to drive me away. He completely erased me from the very thing I created. A collective gasp swept through the lobby. The customers who had been laughing or annoyed were now watching in stunned silence. Some looked away, unable to bear the weight of the truth being revealed. Others stared, their eyes wide with the scope of the injustice. Johnny's words were like blades in the air, cutting through the comfortable version of history that so many had long accepted. Stephen, who had been full of confidence and arrogance, now looked bewildered. His former bravado had vanished, replaced by confusion and fear. He looked at Albert Thorne, as if waiting for an order. Thorne, holding the ledger, quickly flipped through the pages with a trembling hand. Every line he read tightened the knot in his stomach. The signature of Johnny C. Kirby was there, clear and repeated. The handwriting was undeniable. The dates matched. Everything fit together. Thorne's voice was barely a whisper, broken. This can't be. But it was true. The deeper he read, the deeper the truth sank in. These were not the stories of a bitter old man. These were facts, documented, signed, and etched by time. And with every word written on those pages, the long-held history of Chase Bank was slowly cracking. The history that had been buried for over 70 years was now slowly coming to light. In the midst of the heavy silence that had fallen over the bank, Johnny stood tall. His posture was firm, his back straight, his gaze sharp, though time had clearly marked his body. His eyes still burned with a light that had never been extinguished. For over half a century, he had carried the weight of injustice. And now, at last, the truth was beginning to ignite. Nothing could stop it now. For Johnny, this moment was not the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of reclaiming everything that had been forcibly taken from him. Albert, still holding the old ledger, slowly turned another page. His eyes were glued to the old signatures, as if he couldn't believe the evidence before him, emerging from pages forgotten by history. As Johnny stood in silence, he looked toward the large front window. The afternoon sun was shining in, casting light on the polished floor, and in that moment, it was as if he could see the past again, vivid, whole, and raw. He carefully placed the ledger on the nearest table. His fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of emotions resurfacing within him. Everyone inside the bank remained motionless, staring at him as if he were about to reveal a long-buried secret. Johnny slowly raised his head. The sparkle was still in his eyes, but behind it lay decades of pain, disappointment, and betrayal. And then he spoke, his voice gentle but deep, like an echo rising from the ruins of history. In '48, he began, John Williams and I started building this bank from scratch. Back then, a black man had to fight for every single opportunity, but I believed in what we were doing. I believed this bank could be a symbol of fairness, of a more humane system. His voice wavered slightly, as if choked by memory, but he continued, steady and determined, every word filled with truth. John Williams wasn't just a partner. He was my friend. I trusted him. I never imagined that the man I fought alongside would be the one to turn his back on me. A low murmur rippled through the bank again. The demeanor of the people had changed. The weight of Johnny's story was slowly sinking into their hearts and minds. Even Stephen Miller, once full of arrogance, now stood silently, his tough exterior shattered by words that could no longer be denied. Johnny looked around the room, then spoke again, more slowly now, as if he wanted everyone to feel each word. I remember the day it all changed. John held a meeting with some white stockholders, powerful, influential men with deep-seated prejudice. He told them that a black man couldn't lead a bank. He said I would ruin everything. He paused, taking a deep breath, steadying himself against the memory. They believed his lies. They forced me out. They used legal tricks and backroom deals to remove me from the board. And when I fought back, they slammed every door I knocked on. His voice trembled again, but this time with strength. I had evidence, documents, proof. I went to the courts, to lawyers, searching for justice, but no one listened. Back then, people like me weren't given a chance to speak. We were silenced before we could even begin. Johnny's eyes glistened with unshed tears. His jaw was tight, holding back a flood of emotion. The pain of those years, the betrayal, the loneliness, it was still there, raw and alive. I stood before a judge, he continued, and he told me to my face, "Know your place. A black man can't run a bank." The silence was so profound you could hear a pin drop. The people gathered in the lobby, who had earlier been amused or annoyed, were now stunned by reality. Some looked down in shame, others were at a loss for words. They had come for ordinary transactions. Instead, they were being confronted with a long-forgotten history, and they were hearing it, harsh and true. Albert Thorne still stood where he was, speechless. The confidence that once filled his face was gone. What remained was a man in shock, with no idea what to do next. He wanted to control the situation, but it was no longer his to control. Johnny took a deep breath, preparing himself for the words that would follow. The emotion was still in his eyes, but his voice became firm, cutting through the silence with clear, powerful tones. "In the end, they left me with nothing," he said. "My dream was gone, my career, even my name. They erased me from the records, as if I had never existed, as if everything I built was meant for someone else." He stopped and fixed his gaze on Stephen Miller and Albert Thorne, his eyes unblinking. "Now, I have returned, not for revenge, but to make you face the truth. Every dollar in this bank, every tile on this floor, every breath of air in this place came from my sacrifice, my work, my loss." The silence that followed was different from before. His words didn't just tell a story. They opened a wound in history, a wound that had long been covered up, forgotten, and sanitized. But now, It was open again, and it could not be denied. Johnny was no longer just an old stranger. He was no longer the poor man they had laughed at when he walked in. He now stood as a living testament to existence, a symbol of all that society had tried to bury. His very presence was proof that the truth does not die. It just waits for the right moment to rise. And this was that moment. This time, he would not be erased. The air inside the Chase Bank remained heavy and still. Even after Johnny finished speaking, no one said a word, but the weight of his story continued to echo, louder than any voice. Every person in the room stared at the old man, their faces a mixture of disbelief and quiet shame. It was as if time itself had stopped, waiting for the truth to fully embrace every corner of the place. In that silence, Johnny moved again, slowly, carefully, full of purpose. He bent down toward his old canvas bag. Every action was deliberate, as if he wanted each movement to be remembered. His eyes were calm and steady, filled with the strength of a man who had waited decades for this moment. He pulled from the bag a sheaf of old papers, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, as if protecting a treasure from the past. He stood up again, to his full height, and slowly unwrapped the bundle with gentle hands. He turned each page with care, as if holding something sacred. Everyone watched in silence. The tension rose once more. "These," Johnny began, his voice calm and controlled, "are the original legal documents. Proof that I never signed over the ownership of this bank. I never gave it to anyone. Not to John Williams, and certainly not to the Matthews family." The mention of the Matthews surname immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Everyone in Rockview knew the Matthews family. For generations, they had been considered the face of this bank, wealthy, respected, their legacy unquestioned, until now. Albert, standing just a few feet from Johnny, felt his knees go weak. His hands trembled as he tried to maintain his balance. He had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but now, panic was beginning to set in. "What do you mean, Mr. Kirby?" he asked, stammering. "For decades, the Matthews family has owned this bank. They inherited it. It's part of this town's history." Johnny slowly stepped closer, his eyes unwavering, and placed the documents into Thorne's trembling hands. "Just look, Albert," he said softly. "The truth is right there. You've been living a lie passed down to you by people who built their power on betrayal." Though he didn't want to, Thorne began to read, line by line, his eyes tracing the old documents. Every signature, every official seal was real and devastating. There he saw the name Johnny C. Kirby, clear as day, and just as noticeably, he saw the absence of his signature on the documents transferring ownership. It was all there. The bank had been taken from him, not legally, but through deceit and manipulation. On the final pages, only the names of John Williams and the Matthews family appeared. Thorne's lips moved, but no words came out. Finally, he managed a faint whisper. "No, this can't be." He looked up at Johnny, his face pale, as if the world had collapsed beneath him. "If these papers are real..." "They are real," Johnny cut in, his voice firmer now, like a dagger slicing through the silence. "And what they show is that Chase Bank was stolen from me by powerful men who used discrimination to hide their crimes. This wasn't just about greed. This was a historical injustice, and it can no longer be hidden." The previous silence was replaced by low murmurs. Some customers began to pull out their phones to record. Others remained standing, stunned, trying to process the truth that was slowly enveloping them. Something that had once been sacred and unshakable in their town was now crumbling before their eyes. Johnny remained calm. He was no longer just an old man. He was now a witness, a bearer of truth, and finally, he was revealing it for all to see. Albert Thorne, still holding the documents, slowly sank into the nearest chair, dazed. His hands shook as he stared at the papers, pieces of the world he had believed to be real, now exposed as an illusion. The foundation upon which his entire career was built had crumbled. There was no going back. The whispers grew into echoes of shock. Customers glanced outside, some wanting to leave, a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion on their faces. Other hands now held up cameras, documenting something that was no longer a simple scene. It was history in the making, and in the midst of it all, Johnny remained standing. He looked at Stephen Miller, who was still on the edge of the scene, his stance still rigid, one hand gripping his holster. But Johnny didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at him with a quiet, steady compassion. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice kind but unshakable, "I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to expose the truth. Are you really going to protect a lie that has been buried for over 70 years? Stephen didn't answer immediately. He tightened his grip on his holster, but his former self-assurance was gone. He looked around, searching for support, but all he saw were doubt and shock. No one was on his side. "I don't know what kind of show this is," he yelled, a crack in his voice, "and I don't care. You're causing a disturbance in a bank, and you will be held accountable. You're staying right there until the police arrive." But even he could feel the weakness in his words, his authority seeming to have no effect. Thorne, still seated, finally stood up, his voice trembling, his knees feeling weak. "Stephen, that's enough," he said softly. "We need to handle this properly. This isn't what we thought it was. We need to look at the truth." Stephen spun around, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. "What do you mean, Albert? You're just going to let this man destroy everything we've worked for? You believe him?" The room fell silent. Thorne didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at Johnny, then at the documents, and finally at the faces of the people watching, confused, awakened. Johnny remained silent. He didn't need to say anything more, because his eyes said it all. He would not be erased again, and everyone there, whether they admitted it or not, knew that the truth had arrived. And this time, it would not be silenced. As they waited for the police to arrive, one thing became clear. The world inside Chase Bank would never be the same after Johnny Kirby walked through its doors. Johnny's gaze said everything. It was the look of a man who had waited a lifetime for the truth to finally be exposed, a truth that could no longer be ignored, silenced, or hidden beneath layers of power and comfort. And Albert Thorne felt it. He felt every word Johnny had spoken settle like a weight in his chest. The documents were real. The signatures were real. And the story he had long believed the legacy of Chase Bank was nothing but a myth built on deceit and greed. But the truth, however powerful, came with a price. Albert knew who the Matthews family really was. Everyone in Rockview did. They were wealthy, untouchable, and fiercely protective of their reputation. For generations, they had run Chase Bank, and they held the power to destroy anyone who defied them. When this truth came out, a storm was certain. Lawsuits, media attention, an endless court battle. The bank's reputation would be shattered, and with it, Albert's name, his career, everything he had worked for could be erased in an instant. As his mind reeled with visions of the coming storm, Albert looked across the lobby and his eyes met Stephen Miller's. Stephen still had one hand on his holster, his posture rigid, his appearance a clear image of control and order. But now, Albert realized that image was in direct conflict with his conscience. He glanced around at the customers, watching silently. Some were clearly stunned, others seemed moved. There was fear in their eyes, but something else was dawning behind the shock. A budding belief. And Albert felt it too. Johnny, standing alone before everyone, exposed to their judgment, had spoken with dignity and truth. You couldn't fake that kind of strength. The voice of his conscience grew louder. The weight of the knowledge, the real knowledge that Johnny had been cheated and exploited, could no longer be ignored. But almost simultaneously, the shadow of the Matthews family returned to his mind, whispering threats without a single word. He remembered what could follow. Lawsuits, slander, the ruin of everything, perhaps even a threat to his family's safety. Fear seized him. "Albert, are you listening to me?" Stephen's voice snapped him back to the present. It was sharp, full of irritation. "Are you really going to gamble everything for this old man? For some dusty old papers?" Albert turned away from Stephen, his eyes filled with conflict, but they were no longer empty. Not anymore. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked again at Johnny, who was still watching him silently, and in that moment, something shifted, something unspoken but felt an unshakable understanding. Then Albert spoke, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as he continued. "Mr. Miller, we can't act like this. We can't ignore what's in front of us. The documents are real. And Mr. Kirby, he deserves to be heard. We owe him that." Stephen stared at Albert in disbelief. The man he had admired for being firm and decisive now seemed hesitant, weak in his eyes. But before he could speak, Albert spoke again, more firmly now. "I know how powerful the Matthews family is. I know what kind of pressure we'll face if this gets out, but I also know that if we bury this truth again, we will carry the weight of this guilt for the rest of our lives." Silence returned. Johnny nodded slightly, his eyes softening, not with relief, but with respect. This was the beginning of change. After all this time, he had finally reached one person, a heart torn between power and principle. Albert knew what he had done. The moment he spoke those words, he had entered a fight he could no longer escape. The Matthews family would not go down without a fight, but he had made his choice. There was no turning back. As the silence deepened, a strange quiet settled over the lobby. Not just tension, but courage. People looked at each other, wondering what would happen next. And then, quietly, unexpectedly, a new sound broke the silence. The soft footsteps of someone emerging from behind the counter. Everyone turned. It was Evelyn Carter, the youngest employee at Chase Bank. She was known for being quiet, for staying out of serious discussions, and for never raising her voice. She had been watching the entire time, but now, something in her had changed. Evelyn approached, her frame small, her steps light, but in that moment, her presence felt immense. She walked with quiet determination across the marble floor toward the bundles of old money scattered in the middle of the room. Everyone watched in wonder. Stephen was stunned, unable to believe what he was seeing, his face filled with confusion and a hint of disgust. He couldn't understand why, one by one, the people he expected to be his allies were deserting him in front of a man he had just considered worthless. But Evelyn didn't look at him. Her gaze was focused on the money, on the documents, and finally on Johnny, who watched her quietly, a look of recognition in his eyes. She wasn't just approaching a pile of paper and money, she was approaching the truth. It was a small gesture, but it carried extraordinary meaning. What Evelyn did wasn't just respectful, it was a quiet but powerful statement. She didn't have to shout. By simply walking over, she had chosen a side. She believed Johnny, and in that moment, everyone knew it. "I believe you, Mr. Kirby," Evelyn said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the heavy air like a light in the darkness. "Maybe we have been living a lie for a long time. Maybe it's time we stop pretending." As her words echoed off the bank's marble floors, it felt as if time stood still. No one moved, no one breathed. They were witnessing a change, a shift that could never be reversed. Stephen Miller stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock and growing anger, fixed on Evelyn as if she had betrayed everything he stood for. To him, what Evelyn did wasn't just dissent, it was a rebellion, a stab at the authority he had spent his entire life defending. But Evelyn didn't back down. She turned to the other employees, her eyes, once timid and quiet, now blazing with determination. She wasn't just expressing support, she was calling on her colleagues to wake up, to see the truth, and to take a stand. And it didn't take long. Armando, one of the tellers who had been laughing and mocking earlier, stepped forward. He silently picked up a faded banknote from the floor and placed it on the table next to Evelyn's. His face was filled with remorse, and his eyes met Johnny's with a mix of apology and newfound respect. "I believe you too, Mr. Kirby," he said softly. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." One by one, the other employees followed. They approached the scattered banknotes as if they were pieces of a sacred history, and though they said nothing, they carefully placed one in front of Johnny. Their actions were small, their words few, but the message was powerful. They believed. It was a wave of quiet rebellion, not against the bank itself, but against the lie it was built on. Johnny stood silently, watching. His eyes softened with emotion, but he did not cry. He accepted it this moment he had waited over 70 years for. After decades of isolation, of rejection, of struggle, he was no longer alone. These young men and women, most of whom had once doubted him, had made a choice. Despite the risks, despite the pressure, they chose to stand for the truth. In a corner of the room, Stephen Miller remained frozen, like an unmoving stone. But inside, he was slowly cracking. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His own colleagues, one by one, turning their backs on the structure he had fought his whole life to uphold. His hand was still clenched on the holster of his gun, his knuckles white with tension. He was breathing deeply as confusion slowly gave way to rage. For Stephen, this wasn't just a challenge to the bank's authority, it was a threat to the order he believed in. This wasn't just about money, It was about power, control, pride. And now, all of it was slipping through his fingers. Albert Thorne, still standing behind the counter, could hardly believe it either. He watched in silence as his team, his staff, slowly turned away from silence and toward the truth. Evelyn's courage had lit a fire he hadn't expected, but in his heart, he knew it was right. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but now, he wouldn't have to walk it alone. The silence in the lobby seemed to be the beginning of something new. A quiet movement, a silent revolution, one voice, one step, one action at a time. All of it saying that truth is more important than fear. The weight of the moment was like a spreading fire. The air was thick with emotion and tension, almost too much to bear. And then, Stephen exploded. "Are you all insane?" he screamed, his voice sharp, like shattering glass hitting the silence. It echoed off the walls, jolting everyone. His eyes darted around, blazing with fury. He glared at every employee, every customer, every person who had dared to stand with Johnny, as if daring them to look away. For a moment, fear returned to the room, but Johnny remained standing, steadfast. He did not flinch. He slowly turned to face Stephen, their eyes meeting. Though his body was frail, the strength behind his gaze was unbreakable. He didn't blink, because he had seen this kind of anger before. He had felt this kind of power try to crush him many times, but here he was, still standing. His gaze held experience, conviction, and above all, a peace that came not from victory, but from knowing he had spoken his truth, no matter what happened next. Johnny Kirby would not be silenced again. Not this time. The small gesture had a weight that couldn't be measured. What Evelyn did wasn't just respect, it was a quiet but firm declaration. She didn't shout, she didn't protest, but, with a simple action, she had chosen the truth. "I believe you, Mr. Kirby," Evelyn said softly, her voice clear in the heavy silence. "Maybe we have been living a lie for a long time, and maybe it's time to stop pretending." With her words, it seemed time stopped. No one moved. No one spoke. They had witnessed the tide turn, something that could never be turned back. Stephen Miller remained standing, his eyes wide with rage, almost bulging. His gaze toward Evelyn was full of disappointment and confusion, as if she had committed the greatest betrayal. For him, this wasn't just dissent, it was rebellion, a rejection of the authority he had upheld his entire life. But Evelyn didn't retreat. She faced her fellow employees, her once quiet eyes now burning with determination. She wasn't just showing support, she was calling on others to awaken, and they began to wake up. Armando, whose smirk had been so mocking, stepped forward. He silently picked up an old banknote from the floor and placed it on the table. "I believe you too, Mr. Kirby," he whispered, full of remorse. "I'm sorry for what I did earlier. I was wrong." One by one, others followed. They approached the old bills as if they were sacred relics of a time that had been forcibly erased. No one spoke, but everyone showed their stance. A stance that mattered. A stance that was late, but true. Johnny watched in silence, his eyes soft with emotion. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in over 70 years, he was no longer alone. And through it all, Stephen remained in his position, like a solid wall. But inside, his foundation had crumbled. He couldn't accept what he was seeing. The people he had once counted on were now bowing to a man he saw as worthless. His hand was clenched on the holster of his gun, trembling, pale with rage. For him, this was not just about the bank. It was about power, control, identity, and now it was slowly slipping away from him. Meanwhile, Albert Thorne silently observed it all. His employees, one by one, were turning away from silence. Evelyn had lit the fire, and Albert knew it was right. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew he would no longer walk it alone. And in that moment of heavy silence, Stephen snapped. "Are you all insane?" he screamed, like a lightning bolt shattering the quiet. Everyone was startled. Stephen's eyes were angry, red, screaming with fear, but no one backed down. Not Johnny, not Albert, not any of the people who had now chosen to stand. Albert stood up, his heart racing, his mind at war with itself. This was his bank, his people, and his decision. But Stephen was no longer thinking. He was reacting, afraid and desperate. He suddenly drew his gun halfway from its holster. The entire lobby froze. "That's enough," he shouted. "I told you to leave." He aimed the gun at Johnny, a silent but terrifying threat. People gasped. A few quietly crawled toward the exits, but no one dared to speak. This was the tipping point. One wrong move, and there would be no going back. But Johnny remained calm, steady, unafraid. Albert stepped between them, and in that instant, he knew this was the moment, and he moved. He walked forward, took a deep breath, and stood directly between the gun and Johnny Kirby. Everyone was stunned. His knees were trembling slightly, but his voice was firm. "Stephen," he said, "as your manager, I am ordering you to lower your weapon. Now." Stephen looked at him, almost in disbelief. "You're taking his side?" he yelled. "After everything we've built, you trade it all for him?" Albert was unmoved. "This isn't about choosing sides," he answered calmly. "This is about choosing the truth. I've read the documents. There's no denying it. What was done to him was wrong, deliberate, and cruel. And if this bank is to have any future, we need to stop being blind to it." And finally, slowly, Stephen lowered the gun. His hand was shaking, his face still contorted with anger, but his action was one of surrender. "You'll regret this, Albert," he whispered. It was no longer a threat, but an admission, a defeat, and he silently stepped back. Johnny remained standing, unmoving, but now there was a smile on his lips, not of victory, but of peace. He looked at Albert. Their eyes met. No words were needed. A wall built on lies had been broken, and though that moment was over, the real fight was just beginning. But a foundation of hope, courage, and conviction had been laid, and Johnny, for the first time, was no longer a lost name. He was now proof that the truth, no matter how long you hide it, will always rise again. Albert looked around the room. He saw it in their eyes, in Evelyn's, Armando's, and so many others. Quiet strength, unwavering support, and a shared conviction. He spoke again. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice firm. "I'm taking all the documents, all the evidence to the board of directors and the executive committee." He took a deep breath and added, with complete clarity and courage, "I know what this means. I'm risking everything, my job, my future, but I would rather lose it all than work for a place built on silence, injustice, and lies." His words spread through the room like seeds planted in every heart. A wave of quiet understanding and conviction passed through the lobby. Evelyn stepped forward, calm but resolute. "You won't be alone, Albert," she said. "We're with you. Whatever happens, this bank needs to change, and we will be the ones to start that change." The others nodded silently. Armando nodded too, firmly. The older employees looked at each other, as if memories they'd long held now finally had a voice. They all knew the legal battle would be long, messy, and brutal. But stronger than their fear was what they held onto, the truth and the unity of people who would no longer turn away. At the back of the room, Stephen Miller remained silent. The anger was gone, his face a complex mask. It seemed he was slowly beginning to understand that what he thought was a fight for order was actually a fight to protect a lie. He said nothing, but perhaps deep down, something had changed in him too. The next day, Albert Thorne walked into the executive boardroom of Chase Bank. He carried all of Johnny Kirby's evidence, the original ledger, the old documents, the historic banknotes that had been hidden and denied for so long. He stood firmly before the entire board and before the Matthews family, who sat at the center of decades of wealth, pride, and power, and he told the truth. As expected, the room exploded. There was anger, accusations, threats, both overt and subtle, but Albert did not waver. He wasn't standing there for himself, but for Johnny, for the truth, and for the soul of the bank he had once blindly served. It wasn't long before the news spread throughout Rockview. The story of Johnny Kirby and the secrets of Chase Bank became front-page news, dominating headlines and sparking heated discussions throughout the community. More truths came to light, unearthing decades of corruption and denial. It was the beginning of a court battle, and Johnny was no longer just an old man reclaiming what was stolen from him. He had become a symbol of truth, of resilience, of a justice that never truly dies. For Albert, Evelyn, Armando, and the others who had once silently accepted the system, everything had changed. They were no longer just employees. They were now defenders, changemakers, guardians of a more just future. And Stephen, standing on the sidelines, silent, could deny nothing. He had to face a truth he could no longer hide. Johnny's story resonated beyond Rockview. It became an inspiration for others people who had long been silent, dismissed, and ignored. Because the story of Johnny Kirby wasn't just about reclaiming his legacy. It was about all of us, about the courage to speak up, about standing for what's right, and about the belief that the truth still matters. Because it does. So now, we ask you, what do you think is most important when confronting injustice? Is it courage? Is it integrity? Or is it the willingness to give up everything for the sake of what is right? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that inspire hope. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stand up, speak truth, and never stop believing in justice.